A conservator working through the royal collection pulled a case from storage that had no catalog entry, no file, nothing. Every piece in that collection is logged and numbered. This one wasn't, just a single name engraved inside the lid. Catherine. Chapter 1. The case that wasn't on any list. The conservator's job that week was straightforward on paper. Cross-reference a section of the royal collection's older storage inventory against updated digital records, part of a broader effort to modernize how the collection's thousands of items are tracked and preserved. Most cabinets in that particular storage room had been cataloged decades ago, with little reason to expect surprises. According to someone familiar with how the discovery unfolded, the cabinet in question was tucked into a corner of the room, one of several that hadn't been fully opened in years, simply because nothing inside it had changed or required attention. When she finally worked through to it, she found the case sitting at the back, separate from the other items, wrapped in a protective cloth that looked considerably newer than anything else stored nearby. That detail alone was unusual. Most items in that section had been sitting undisturbed for so long that their wrapping had aged along with them. This cloth hadn't. She pulled the case forward and checked the reference she'd been given for that cabinet's contents. Nothing matched. According to this account, she checked twice, assuming she'd simply misread the inventory sheet, before confirming that whatever this case was, it didn't correspond to any entry on the official list at all. That's the moment this stopped being routine. The Royal Collection operates under one of the most rigorous documentation systems in the world, specifically because its contents carry historical, financial, and constitutional significance that requires every item to be traceable. Provenance matters enormously here, not just for insurance purposes, but because items of this nature sometimes carry questions about ownership, inheritance, and intended use that only proper documentation can settle. An item with no inventory number isn't simply missing paperwork. It suggests something was deliberately kept outside the formal system that governs everything else in that collection, which raises an obvious question. Who would have the authority to do that, and why? According to someone with knowledge of how the collection's records are maintained, only a small handful of people have ever held the authority to keep something outside standard documentation, and historically, that authority has rested almost exclusively with the reigning monarch. Not with private secretaries, not with collection curators, regardless of how senior, the monarch alone. That detail narrows the list of people responsible for this case considerably. By the time the conservator opened the case enough to see the engraving inside the lid, the late Queen's connection to it had already become the most likely explanation, simply based on who would have had the standing to set something this significant outside the normal system in the first place. She didn't open the case fully that day. According to this account, she did exactly what protocol requires when something unexpected and potentially significant surfaces inside the collection. She photographed it exactly as found, logged the cabinet location and the date, and contacted her supervisor immediately rather than attempting to determine on her own what she'd found or why. That restraint matters here because it tells you this wasn't handled carelessly. The conservator understood immediately that whatever sat inside that case, its significance was likely to extend well beyond a simple piece of jewelry, and she treated it with exactly the caution that understanding required. Her supervisor arrived within the hour, according to this source, and the two of them examined the case together, still without opening it fully, simply confirming the engraving and the absence of any corresponding inventory record. The supervisor reportedly recognized immediately what this likely meant, given the name involved, and made the decision to escalate the matter directly to the senior staff responsible for managing communications between the collection and the Wales household specifically. That escalation happened quickly, within the same day according to this account. Whoever made that call understood that an item engraved with Catherine's name, deliberately kept outside formal documentation, almost certainly originated with the late Queen, and that decisions about what to do with it weren't something a conservator or even a department supervisor should be making independently. By the following morning, according to someone familiar with how this moved through the household, word had reached Catherine's own office with a request that someone from her team be present when the case was finally opened in full, rather than having it examined and documented entirely by collection staff without her awareness. That request alone tells you something important about how seriously this discovery was being treated. Items inside the royal collection are typically handled and cataloged by collection staff as a matter of course, without requiring the direct involvement of the family member potentially connected to them. The decision to involve Catherine's office before the case was even fully opened suggests everyone aware of the discovery already understood. This wasn't simply another piece of jewelry to be logged and stored. It was personal, deliberately so. And whatever the late queen had intended by setting it apart from everything else in that collection, nobody involved in the discovery wanted to be the one who opened it without giving Catherine herself the chance to be there when it finally happened. That meeting was scheduled for 3 days later, giving collection staff time to prepare the case properly for formal examination, and giving Catherine's office time to confirm who, specifically, would represent her when the moment finally came. Whatever sat inside that case had waited, untouched, for years. It could wait 3 more days. Chapter 2. What was inside the case? Catherine arrived in person rather than sending a representative, according to someone familiar with how that morning unfolded. Nobody on the collection staff had specifically requested that she come herself, but apparently nobody was surprised when she did. The senior conservator who first opened the case fully described the room as quiet in a way that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with genuine anticipation. The case itself, once unwrapped completely, turned out to be older than the cloth surrounding it suggested. According to this account, the leather exterior showed wear consistent with decades of careful storage, though the protective wrapping had clearly been replaced at some point more recently, likely by whoever had last handled it before it was sealed away. Inside, set against dark fabric that had faded slightly with age, sat 3 pieces. The first was a brooch, smaller than most ceremonial pieces in the collection, shaped in a design that one specialist present that day identified immediately as consistent with jewelry commissioned in the early 1950s. Sapphires, small but exceptionally well matched in color, set in a pattern that didn't correspond to any publicly documented piece currently cataloged elsewhere in the collection. That detail matters. Most significant royal jewelry has been photographed extensively over the decades, worn at public occasions, documented in countless official images. A piece this well crafted, from this specific period, with no existing public record at all, suggested it had never been worn publicly, not once, in over 70 years. The second item was a pair of earrings, simpler in design, but clearly created to complement the brooch, matching sapphires set in a narrower band of gold. According to the specialist examining them that day, the craftsmanship matched a particular jeweler known to have done private work for the royal family during that same period, work that, unlike the more famous commissioned pieces from that era, was rarely documented publicly at the family's specific request. The third item, tucked beneath the other 2 in a separate fitted compartment, was a ring. Modest by royal standards, a single sapphire surrounded by a simple band. The kind of piece that wouldn't necessarily draw attention in a formal portrait, but that carried, according to the specialist's initial assessment, a level of craftsmanship suggesting it had been made with particular care rather than simply selected from existing stock. 3 pieces, a complete, coordinated set, designed and crafted together, deliberately kept out of any public record for over 7 decades. According to someone present in the room that day, Catherine didn't say much as each piece was lifted carefully from its compartment. She reportedly examined the brooch closely first, turning it slightly under the light before setting it down gently and moving to the earrings, then finally the ring. What struck several people present, according to this account, wasn't simply the pieces themselves, though their craftsmanship alone would have justified serious attention. It was the deliberate completeness of the set. Whoever commissioned these pieces hadn't simply set aside a single brooch or a leftover ring from another collection. They had been designed together from the very beginning as a match set intended for one specific purpose. The question that immediately followed, according to this source, was obvious. If these pieces had been created together, this carefully, and never worn publicly even once, why commission them at all? Jewelry of this caliber, created specifically for the royal family during this period, wasn't typically made simply to sit unused. It was made to be worn, photographed, documented as part of the family's visible legacy. Unless, according to the specialist's working theory that day, it had been made with a very different purpose from the very beginning, not for public display at all. Created instead specifically to be given, privately, to someone the late Queen intended to receive it personally, rather than pieces meant to enter the broader rotation of jewelry worn for state occasions and photographed for the public record. That theory, speculative as it was in that initial moment, gained considerably more weight once the conservator carefully lifted the fabric lining beneath where the ring had been resting and found something tucked into a thin pocket sewn directly into the case's interior. A folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly with age, sealed inside a small protective sleeve that had clearly been added separately from the original case construction, likely at some point well after the jewelry itself had been commissioned and stored. According to this account, the room went quiet in a different way at that point. Not the quiet of careful examination anymore, but something closer to the recognition that whatever explanation existed for this case, for its absence from any formal record, for the deliberate completeness of the set inside it, was likely sitting folded in that thin protective sleeve, waiting to finally be read. Catherine reportedly asked to be the one to open it. Nobody present objected. The senior conservator carefully removed the sleeve, confirmed it could be opened safely without damaging the paper inside, and handed it directly to her. What was written on that single folded page would explain everything the jewelry itself had only hinted at. Why these specific pieces existed, why they had been kept entirely separate from the rest of the collection for over 7 decades, and why, of everyone who might eventually have received something this carefully made and this deliberately hidden, the late Queen had apparently decided, long before anyone could have predicted it, that it belonged with Catherine specifically. Chapter 3. The Note That Explained It. Catherine unfolded the page carefully, according to someone present in the room, and read it silently before saying anything aloud. The handwriting matched the late Queen's, the same small, precise script, familiar to anyone who has handled her personal correspondence. The note ran just over half a page, dated roughly 18 months before her death. It opened simply, the way her private notes typically did. No formal greeting beyond Catherine's name. According to this account, the first line explains something nobody in that room had anticipated. The jewelry wasn't made for Catherine originally. It had been made for the late Queen herself, commissioned privately in the early years of her reign, a period she apparently still thought about, often even decades later. The note went on to explain why these specific pieces had never appeared publicly. According to this account, the late Queen wrote that she'd commissioned them during a period when she felt, in her own words, considerably less certain of herself than the public ever saw, a private set she wore only a handful of times, always away from cameras before eventually setting them aside entirely as her public role solidified into the version of herself everyone came to know. That detail reframes the jewelry completely. These weren't pieces meant for grand state occasions or public ceremony. They were, by her own account, almost the opposite. A private comfort, worn quietly during years she didn't entirely trust herself yet, then put away once she no longer needed that particular comfort the same way. The note's next section explained why, decades later, she decided this specific set belonged with Catherine rather than passing through the usual channels that govern how royal jewelry eventually gets distributed among family members. According to this account, she wrote that she'd watched Catherine, over a number of years, navigate something she recognized immediately: the specific discomfort of being watched constantly, while still privately uncertain whether you were doing any of it correctly. She apparently didn't frame this as flattery. The note, according to the person describing it, was notably plain and direct, almost clinical in how it laid out her reasoning. She wrote that she recognized in Catherine the same private uncertainty she remembered feeling herself, decades earlier, the gap between the composed version of yourself the public sees, and the considerably less settled version that exists when nobody's watching. That recognition, according to the note, was the entire reason behind the decision, not formal duty, not any obligation tied to succession or inherited tradition. Simply the late queen, near the end of her life, deciding that something she'd once needed privately should go to someone she believed might need exactly the same thing. There's a specific line near the middle of the note that several people present that day have described almost identically since. Because of how directly it addressed something nobody had expected this discovery to touch on at all. The late queen wrote that she'd considered giving these pieces to Catherine publicly, formally, as part of some occasion where the gesture itself might carry symbolic weight for the institution. She decided against that, according to this account, for a reason she explained plainly. She wrote that the entire point of these pieces had always been their privacy, their distance from public performance, and that handing them over formally, with cameras present, would undo the only thing that had ever made them meaningful to her in the first place. That's why the case had no inventory number. That's why it sat separate from the rest of the collection, wrapped and sealed, waiting for someone to eventually find it rather than being formally transferred through any official channel. The late queen apparently wanted this discovery to happen exactly the way it did, quietly, without ceremony, found rather than presented. The note closed, according to this account, without any instruction about what Catherine should do with the pieces going forward, no suggestion that she wear them publicly, no request that she keep them similarly private. The late queen apparently left that decision entirely to her, writing only that she hoped, whatever Catherine chose to do with them, she'd understand they were never meant as jewelry in the conventional sense. They were meant as evidence, proof in physical form, that the uncertainty Catherine may have felt at various points navigating her own role wasn't a flaw or a weakness to overcome quietly and never mention. It was something the late queen herself had carried for years, privately, behind a public composure the entire world mistook for effortless confidence. Catherine reportedly read the note a second time, before folding it back along its original creases, according to this account. She didn't say much in that room afterward, beyond confirming quietly that she understood what she was looking at and thanking the staff present for handling the discovery with the care it clearly deserved. What she did with that understanding in the weeks that followed is where this story moves from a simple discovery into something with considerably more weight attached to it. Chapter 4. Why Catherine? Specifically, the question hanging over everything by this point wasn't really about the jewelry anymore. It was about timing. Why specifically had the late queen decided, in the final 18 months of her life, that this particular set belonged with Catherine rather than continuing to sit untouched, the way it apparently had for the better part of 7 decades? According to someone familiar with how this part of the story has been pieced together, the answer connects to a specific period roughly 2 years before the note was written, a stretch of time that several people close to the late queen describe as noticeably different in how she engaged with Catherine compared to earlier years. Catherine had been part of the family for well over a decade by then, long enough that the early uncertainty of adjusting to royal life had largely settled into something more practiced and composed. According to this account, the late queen had watched that adjustment happen gradually, the way she watched most things inside her own family without commenting on it directly at the time. What apparently shifted her thinking, according to someone with knowledge of conversations from that period, was a specific stretch of weeks during which Catherine was managing an unusually demanding set of public engagements, several of them tied to causes she'd personally championed for years. While privately dealing with a family matter she chose not to discuss publicly at all. The late queen, according to this account, noticed the gap between the two. Publicly, Catherine appeared exactly as composed and engaged as always. No visible sign that anything beneath the surface was different from any other week. Privately, according to someone who spoke with the late queen around that time, she'd apparently expressed concern to a close aide about whether Catherine had enough genuine support during a period that clearly demanded more of her than the public ever saw. That concern, according to this account, wasn't really about the specific situation itself. It was about recognizing something the late queen apparently understood intimately from her own decades in a similar position: the specific isolation of performing composure constantly, in public, while privately carrying something considerably heavier than anyone watching could see. She'd lived that exact gap herself for most of her adult life. According to people who knew her well during her own early years on the throne, the late queen rarely allowed herself any visible uncertainty in public, even during periods of genuine personal difficulty, training herself early to separate what the role required from whatever she happened to be feeling privately at any given moment. That training, according to this account, came at a cost she apparently understood more clearly toward the end of her life than she had while actively living through it. She'd once described that gap to a close aide, years before any of this, as the loneliest part of the entire role. Not the public scrutiny itself, but the specific isolation of never being able to let anyone see exactly how uncertain you sometimes felt underneath it. Watching Catherine navigate something similar, according to this account, brought that memory back with unusual clarity. Not because the specific circumstances matched exactly, but because the underlying experience, performing steadiness while privately uncertain, was something the late queen recognized immediately, having lived inside it herself for the better part of 70 years. That recognition is what apparently moved her, sometime in the following months, to retrieve the case that had sat untouched for decades and decide its time had finally come. According to someone familiar with how this decision was made, she didn't consult anyone before writing the note or arranging for the case to be sealed away in storage, deliberately separate from the rest of the collection. This raises an obvious comparison to the contrast this same story draws against Camilla, a comparison worth addressing directly rather than leaving implied. According to people familiar with the late queen's relationship with both women, the distinction here wasn't really about formal acceptance or institutional standing. Camilla had, by most accounts, achieved a settled, functional relationship with the late queen well before her death, built carefully over years. What this particular gift reflects is something narrower and more specific than general approval or acceptance. It's about a very particular kind of recognition, the late queen seeing in Catherine a specific echo of her own private experience, the gap between public composure and private uncertainty, in a way she apparently never identified as directly with anyone else inside the family, including Camilla. That's not necessarily a statement about Camilla's character or her standing. According to this account, the late queen's relationship with Camilla had simply followed a different shape entirely, built through different circumstances, with a different kind of history behind it. Camilla's path into the family had never required navigating the exact specific isolation these jewels were apparently meant to address. The particular experience of being thrust, relatively young, into a role requiring public composure she hadn't yet had years to fully grow into. Catherine's path matched the late queen's own far more directly. Young, married into an institution she hadn't been born into, learning in real time how to separate the public version of herself from whatever she actually felt privately while the entire world watched her figure it out. That specific parallel, according to this account, is what made the late queen's own private jewelry feel like the right gift, in a way that no other comparable gesture quite would have captured. There's a detail worth adding here, because it complicates the picture in a useful way rather than simplifying it further. According to someone close to the household, the late queen apparently considered, at one point, creating something similar for Camilla as well. A private gesture distinct from these specific jewels, but ultimately decided against it for reasons that had nothing to do with affection or acceptance. She reportedly felt that whatever gesture she might offer Camilla needed to reflect Camilla's own specific experience, rather than simply mirroring what she'd already decided to give Catherine. According to this account, she never settled on what that gesture should actually be before her health declined too far to act on it, which means whatever she may have eventually intended for Camilla specifically, if anything at all, was never finished or recorded anywhere that anyone has since found. That detail matters because it suggests this story isn't really about exclusion in the way it might initially appear. It's about the specific, deeply personal nature of how the late queen apparently chose to express recognition, tailored individually rather than distributed evenly, with Catherine's gift completed and Camilla's, whatever it might have been, simply running out of time before it ever took shape. Catherine received something finished. deliberate. Tied directly to a specific recognition, the late queen apparently felt strongly enough to act on, quietly, without consulting anyone, in the final years of her life. What that recognition means for how Catherine carries the role going forward is the question this entire discovery ultimately leaves behind. Chapter 5. What the discovery means. Now, 3 weeks after that case was finally opened in full, a decision had to be made about what would actually happen to the jewelry itself. A decision that, according to someone familiar with the process, involved more careful conversation than the discovery's quiet, private nature might suggest. The Royal Collection's standard practice for items of significant historical value typically involves formal cataloging, conservation assessment, and a decision about whether a piece remains within institutional custody or is formally transferred into a family member's personal possession. According to this account, the senior staff overseeing the collection understood almost immediately that this particular case wasn't going to follow the standard path cleanly, given everything the note inside it had explained. The first formal meeting about the jewelry's future took place with a notably small group present, according to someone familiar with how it was handled. Catherine herself, the senior curator who had overseen the collection for years, and, somewhat unusually according to this account, William, who had apparently asked to be included once he learned what had been found. William's presence in that meeting matters, according to the person describing it, because it confirmed something about how seriously this discovery was being treated beyond simply being a private, sentimental gesture between two people. The late Queen's note had been explicit about her intentions, but formally determining what that meant for the jewelry's actual legal and institutional status still required input from someone with broader authority over how the family's collection arrangements work. According to this account, the conversation in that meeting was relatively brief. The curator confirmed that, based on the note's clear language and the deliberate way the case had been set apart from formal inventory, there was a reasonable basis to treat this as a personal gift from the late Queen during her lifetime, rather than an item requiring formal institutional transfer through the usual collection processes. William reportedly agreed without much hesitation, according to this source, stating plainly that whatever process existed for handling jewelry of significant historical value, his grandmother had clearly gone out of her way to set this specific gift outside that process entirely, and he didn't see a reason to force it back into formal channels now, years after she'd already made her intentions explicit in writing. That agreement settled the practical question relatively quickly, though it left open something more interesting than the legal status of 3 pieces of jewelry: what Catherine actually intended to do with them going forward once the formal questions had been resolved. According to someone close to her, she didn't make any immediate public statement or gesture connected to the discovery, which several people familiar with her general approach to private family matters describe as entirely consistent with how she's handled similar situations before. There was no announcement, no carefully staged photograph, nothing that suggested she viewed this as something requiring public acknowledgement at all. What she apparently did do, according to this account, happened roughly 6 weeks after the discovery, during a private family gathering rather than any formal occasion. She wore the ring, specifically just the ring, to a small dinner that included Charles, Camilla, and a handful of close family friends. The kind of low-key occasion where most people present wouldn't think twice about noticing a single piece of unfamiliar jewelry. Charles apparently noticed immediately, according to someone present that evening. He'd been briefed on the discovery earlier, given his position and his direct connection to his mother's personal effects, and reportedly recognized the ring the moment he saw it, despite never having seen it worn in person before in his entire life. According to this account, he didn't say anything about it directly during the dinner itself, choosing instead to mention it to Catherine privately afterward, asking simply whether that was, in fact, the ring from the case everyone had been discussing. She confirmed it was, according to this source, and the conversation between them moved on relatively quickly from there, without much further discussion needed. That quiet exchange, more than any public moment, captures something important about how this entire discovery has ultimately settled. Catherine didn't choose to display the jewelry as a statement, didn't wear the full set together for some symbolic occasion designed to make a point about legacy or succession. She wore one piece quietly to an ordinary family dinner, the same way the late Queen herself had apparently worn these specific pieces decades earlier, away from cameras, without any audience beyond the people who already understood what they meant. That choice, according to people who've discussed it since, feels consistent with everything the late Queen's note actually asked for. Not public acknowledgement, not a formal gesture marking some symbolic transfer of legacy from one generation to the next. Simply private use, exactly as originally intended, by someone who apparently understood immediately why these pieces had been kept so deliberately separate from everything else for over 7 decades. The brooch and earrings, according to this account, remain in Catherine's private possession, kept, as far as anyone outside her immediate circle knows, exactly the way the late Queen apparently always intended them to be kept. Quietly, privately. Worn occasionally, perhaps, away from any audience that would turn their meaning into something more public than they were ever meant to carry. What this discovery ultimately confirms isn't really about jewelry at all, despite everything that's been written and discussed about the specific pieces themselves. It's about a particular kind of recognition the late Queen apparently extended to exactly one person near the end of her life, based on something she recognized in Catherine that mirrored her own private experience closely enough to feel worth acting on quietly, without consulting anyone in the time she had left. That recognition arrived 7 decades after the jewelry itself was first made, sitting unused and unlisted, waiting specifically for someone capable of understanding what it actually meant. It found its way to Catherine exactly the way the late Queen apparently always intended, found rather than presented, private rather than performed, and worn finally the same quiet way it had always been worn the very first time. Decades before Catherine had any idea this story would ever include her at all. The late Queen spent 70 years being watched by the entire world, rarely letting anyone see what staying composed actually cost her. In this case, she kept the physical proof of that cost sealed away, untouched for decades, simply waiting for someone who might need to know that they weren't the first to feel that weight. Catherine didn't turn this profound gift into a public statement. There was no grand announcement and no stage photograph. Instead, she chose to wear the single ring quietly to an ordinary dinner, exactly the way the late Queen first wore it, far away from any audience that would turn its private meaning into a spectacle. That is the true legacy of this moment. Recognition doesn't always need to be loud to matter. Sometimes the most significant thing one person can give another is simply proof that the hardest parts of carrying a heavy burden were never carried alone, even when the rest of the world wasn't watching closely enough to notice. If this story stayed with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more. There is always one more case worth opening.